If you're stuck on auto mode and your camera feels more like a spaceship than it does a creative tool, you're in the right place. In today's video, I'm going to go over everything you need to know to take your camera from auto over to manual mode, and we'll be discussing the exposure triangle and how ISO, shutter speed, and aperture all work together to help you take a really good photo. Hey guys, I'm Carlos J. Soda. Welcome back to my channel. I take the influence out of photography and I focus on what makes you money, not what makes you spend it. And today we're talking about all things manual mode and how to get you feeling more comfortable taking your camera off auto over to full manual. Now, this is the first video of a 4-part series. Today in this video, we're doing a deep dive to understand the exposure triangle, and the other 3 videos will be going more deeper into aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and exactly what they do to your videos. So if you want to keep up with those 3 videos, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell to be notified when they come out. With photography, it's really important to remember that this is a complicated thing to get your head around. So don't feel bad if you don't get it in the first go. You might want to watch this video once or twice just so it really starts to sink in. When I taught myself photography about 10 years ago, I got so stuck on these manual settings because it just didn't quite make sense to me. And it wasn't until someone just said it in a way that just snapped and made complete sense to me that I finally started to feel a little bit more confident. So you may have watched some technical videos and you're still sitting there going, I don't know what you're talking about. Hopefully this video will demystify it a little bit. I'm going to use a lot of analogies and simplify it just so it starts to make a little bit more sense, so you feel like you know what the camera's doing when you're changing those settings. So the first thing we need to know is the exposure triangle. And if you haven't heard of this before, essentially what it's referring to is the 3 elements of photography and how they all correlate together. So you've got ISO, you've got aperture, and you've got shutter speed. And these are all settings that you can change individually on your camera that will affect the way your photo turns out. Let's have a look at what the exposure triangle actually is. You can see we have 3 elements here. We've got shutter speed, we've got aperture, and we've got ISO, and a whole bunch of numbers that probably mean nothing to you. This is what we're going to unpack. Everything in photography is about light, how light is affecting the camera sensor, which will decide on what your exposed photos look like. Photography is literally understanding light. And of course, there's that real sciencey element of it, and then there's the more creative, artistic side of it. Once you have a really good understanding of these fundamentals, it will help you become far more creative as you go down your photography career. Now, I want you to grab your camera because you're going to be using it as we go through this, and it's going to start to make a little bit more sense when you have it in your hand. The first element that we're going to be looking at is aperture. And if you have a look at the lens on your camera, you might have a kit lens or you might have your own lens that you've attached yourself. You're going to see an f-stop number or an aperture number. And on my lens here, which is a 24mm prime, I can see it says 1.4. It might say 1:1.4. It might have f1.4. Every manufacturer does it a little bit differently. But essentially what that's referring to is the widest aperture that your lens is capable of. A lot of the entry-level cameras or the kit lenses will start at maybe f4. I've even seen them go up to like f5.8. Essentially what that's saying is that's the maximum amount of light that can come into your camera using that lens. So I want you to think of this analogy. Your aperture is essentially a window into your room. The wider the window, the more amount of light is coming in. The narrower the window, the less amount of light is coming in. That is the role of aperture with your camera. It's allowing light to come into the camera, or it's taking away light. But your aperture actually has a second role, and this is where it gets a little bit tricky. Not only is it controlling the amount of light that's coming into the camera, it's also controlling the depth of field. Now, to understand depth of field, I want you to have a think of a landscape in front of you. Let's say you're standing and in front of you there's a cow, and behind the cow there's a fence, and behind the fence there's a tree, and behind the tree there's a house. Your depth of field is essentially referring to the distance between you and those objects in front of you. So your aperture will help you control which part of that scene you want to focus on. For example, I might only want to focus on the cow, which would mean that the tree and the fence and the house behind it is completely blurry. That is depth of field. Or I might want to focus only on the house, which means the cow, the tree, and the fence will be blurry. Your aperture is determining which part of that depth of field you want to focus on. And that's something that you can use when you're being creative with your photos. So when we have a look at aperture, the wider the aperture means the more amount of light's coming into the camera. It also means you're focusing on a very small part of the depth. And this is where it gets a bit tricky because it seems like the opposite. The wider the aperture, the less you can focus on in the depth of field in front of you. And then the opposite, the narrower the aperture, the less amount of light coming into the camera, the more you're able to focus on with all of that depth in front of you. So, for example, if you want to take a photo of that cow in the scene, you might have a wide aperture of 2.8 because you're letting a lot of light in and you're also isolating the cow from the backdrop. But if you want to get that whole landscape and you want to see everything, you would need to use a higher aperture to make sure everything's in focus. So now I can hear you saying, well, hang on a minute. Now if I have a really wide aperture, it's really bright and I can't really see the cow. Well, this is why we need to start looking at shutter speed. So you can see already that not only do these elements all work together, you can't just use one setting to get the photo that you want. So now that we have a very basic understanding of aperture, we're going to have a look at what those numbers are doing. So when we look at the aperture on your lens, mine is 1.4, that's the widest it can get. Now the wider the aperture, the more blurry your backdrop. And you may have heard this before, bokeh. Bokeh is essentially referring to the out of focus points of your photo. And that can give you a really nice artistic look. I'm a big fan of bokeh. A lot of my favorite photos, as you'll see here on the screen, use bokeh. I just think it's a really nice way of isolating the subject that I'm photographing, and it gives you a really cool look. Now, just to confuse you even more, bokeh varies from lens to lens. Now, I'm not going to go into the specifics of that because I don't want to overcomplicate things. There will be more videos where I'm going to go more in depth to aperture and focal point and ISO and shutter speed. But today, I just want to get your head around the exposure triangle. So if you have a lens that might say f5.8 or f4.0, you're not going to get a huge amount of bokeh. Why? Because your aperture isn't that wide. This lens here has an aperture of 1.4, meaning it's as wide as you can really get. Now there are some lenses that might go f1 or f1.2, but that is pretty wide, meaning if I was to focus on my face, by the time the photo got to my ears would start to be blurry because it's a very narrow depth of field. Now, if I was shooting a portrait of myself, and I do want that bokeh, but I want to make sure that the rest of my face is in focus, I probably wouldn't shoot at f1.4. I would start to adjust my aperture correctly. So I might come up to say f2, I might come up to f2.8, I might even come up to f4. So what you're essentially doing, as you're taking light away from the scene, you're also adding more focus back into the frame. I hope that makes sense. I understand it's pretty complicated. The higher up you go with your aperture, the more you're capturing, but the less light is coming into the frame. So if we have a look here at these aperture rings, this is a pretty good way to visualize what's happening to your camera. You can see here the widest ring is f1.4, which is what I was just referring to, and then it goes all the way up to f22. What we're looking at here are the lens blades, and the wider they are, the lower the aperture, or the wider the aperture. So you can see f1.4, but as those blades start to come in together, you can see that the circle in the middle is getting narrower. So at f22, those blades have almost completely closed in, meaning not much light is coming into the lens. Now we're going to have a look at shutter speed and the role shutter speed plays in the exposure triangle. And shutter speed is exactly what it sounds like. It is how fast your shutter is opening and closing, which also impacts the amount of light coming into your camera. And I know this is starting to get confusing because aperture controls the light coming into the lens, but so does shutter speed. But like aperture, it also has a second role, and that is to capture motion. So if you have a think about a car, when a car's stationary, it's easy to take a photo of it. You can just sit there, click a photo, and you capture that car. But if the car's driving really fast, it's going to be a lot harder to capture that photo unless your shutter speed is going really fast. So let's have a look at how this all works. If there's less light coming into the camera is able to capture things at a faster pace. If the shutter speed is slower, it's allowed to capture more light to allow more detail in the image. So let's have a look at a couple of images here. The first one, we have a Formula One car. Now, as you guys know, these cars move incredibly fast. If I just had a normal shutter speed of, let's say, 1/250, the car will be already around the corner by the time I've pressed the shutter. So we need to be able to match the speed of the car. So a lot of F1 photography is done at really high shutter speeds, probably 1/4000 or even higher. But if we have a look at this waterfall image here, you can see that water is looking all soft and beautiful. To capture the water like this, we need to slow it down. So we have a slower shutter. And depending on the outcome of the photo that you want and also your creative spin on the scene, you will adjust shutter speed to be able to either stop motion or slow it down. So let's have a look at aperture and shutter speed and how they work together. Let's think back to that landscape we were just looking at. We have a cow, behind the cow we have a fence and then a tree and then the house. Now before I talked about needing a wide aperture to be able to isolate the cow from the backdrop because we want bokeh in the shot. So if we want to get bokeh, we need to have the aperture nice and wide because it's blurring out all the detail behind the subject that we're focused on. But let's say it's midday sun and it's really bright outside. If I adjust my aperture all the way open, that means a huge amount of light is coming into the lens. So we're going to need to compensate with our shutter speed to make sure that everything's not all blown out or just like a big white photo. So what will we do? Well, we want to focus here on aperture because that's our priority. We've said we want bokeh and we want to isolate the cow from the backdrop. So what we're going to do is adjust our shutter speed accordingly to make sure the photo's not blown out. So we might move our shutter speed up to like 1/1000, and if it's particularly bright, you might even have to go higher than that. It might even be 1/2000, 1/4000. It really depends on the amount of light that's in the scene in front of you. And you can see now that those two play together to be able to help you either compensate or make up for a lack of light in the photo. So if we have a look at this waterfall image again, this is shot in a rainforest. Now in a rainforest, it's quite dense. There's not a huge amount of sunlight. So if I'm slowing down my shutter to make sure that I'm capturing the water, but what's happening then is I'm letting heaps of light into the frame because the shutter is opening and closing at a slower speed, I'm going to need to adjust my aperture up to a higher number to limit the amount of light coming in. So that's how aperture and shutter speed work together simultaneously to help you get a correctly exposed image. Now, which one's more important than the other? It totally depends on the outcome of the photo. If you're a landscape photographer, you might be wanting more and more things in focus, particularly if you've got a lot of different objects there. But if you're a portrait photographer or you're a street photographer or a fashion photographer, you want to focus on the subject itself and let everything else sort of take a back seat in the frame. It's totally up to you, and what's right to you will be totally different to someone else, and this is the beauty of photography. I can give you the foundations of the exposure triangle, but when it comes to how to use it and how to apply it, that's all up to your individual interpretation. Now we're going to look at the final element, and that is ISO. ISO is essentially referring to how sensitive your camera is to the light available to it. So if aperture is responsible for how much light's coming into the lens, but also how much depth of field you're capturing, and shutter speed's also responsible for how much light comes into the lens, but capturing motion, your ISO is in charge of making you compensate for the lack of light, but whilst it's doing that, it's also actually degrading the image. Because when there's limited light available, the camera can't make up all that missing information, and you might need to compensate, and you'll compensate with the ISO. But as you'll notice, when you start to turn your ISO up, you're going to start to get what we call noise, which makes the image look a bit grainy, and the more you go up with ISO, you'll actually see the image starts to really deteriorate. Now some cameras, especially the Sonys, are actually quite good in low light, but even in really low light, as you bump that ISO up, you will start to see noise and grain. And again, some people really like it. Again, it's just totally up to your artistic interpretation. Myself, when I'm shooting, I use my shutter speed or aperture first, and I'll only use ISO when I absolutely have to because I like my images to look really sharp and really clean. Now I know this is really overwhelming, which is why I'm giving you guys a free little download on my website, which is a cheat sheet for exactly what we've been talking about. In this cheat sheet, I break it all down for you exactly like we've done here, but you can take this with you as a reference point to help you start to learn those settings. The link will be in the description box below. Now that we've had a look at the exposure triangle and we kind of understand what all those elements are doing, I want you to take it easy on yourself. This is not meant to be easy and you're not going to get it all in one go. So rather than going straight over to manual mode, let's have a look at some other settings that we can use today to help you feel a little bit more confident with your camera. And the first thing I want to introduce you to is aperture priority. Now on your camera, it might be represented by an A or an AV, and it'll be on the top of your camera somewhere where you can just adjust that over. So aperture priority is exactly what it sounds like. It's prioritizing aperture above shutter speed and ISO. Now, why I really recommend this setting for beginners is because when you've got all three of those elements together and you're under the pump and you're feeling the pressure, you're going to get really flustered and potentially take some really crappy photos when you really want to take good photos. So if you're trying to learn to use your camera and you're taking it to a friend's wedding or you're on holidays and you're sitting there and you're mucking around with manual settings and you're missing the thing that you want to take photos of, you start to get really annoyed. You're like, I hate photography. You throw it in the bin and then you're done. Well, let's avoid that. Let's just make it easy for all of us. I learned on aperture priority mode and it was the best thing I did, and I highly, highly recommend it for you guys as well. Because what it does is just eliminates all of the decision making for you. Aperture is a really good one because that's the more artistic element that we all like to play with. So if you want to capture bokeh and you want to have those really nice blurry images, or you want to capture more of a landscape and all of the scene, setting that aperture first will help you prioritize that. And then your camera is just going to adjust the shutter speed and the ISO to compensate. The best time to move over to complete manual mode is when you have no pressure on you and you're just sitting around and you want to have a play with your camera. Learning manual mode involves you just sitting there, playing around with all the different settings and having a look what happens to the photo as you're shooting. So again, you might want to start with your aperture, and if you're sitting in your lounge room, look at an object, set your aperture, and don't adjust your shutter speed or your ISO, just flick your lens over. You might go from f2.8 to f4 to f8, all the way up to f11 or f20, and have a look at how dark the frame's getting, but also how much more is in focus. And whilst you're doing that, you might then go, all right, I'm going to start adjusting the shutter speed to see what happens when I'm at f16. And you'll start to understand what's happening between those two elements. The only time you need to adjust your ISO is if things are starting to get really dark and you want to compensate a little bit, you can go up. Now remember, ISO is going to degrade your image, so use it sparingly. When it comes to photography, there's a lot of experts and a lot of people are going to tell you the definitive way to take a photo, and I can tell you now, it's all nonsense. There is no one way to learn photography. There is no one way to use your camera. It is the most subjective art form. What you think is good, someone else might think is total rubbish, and vice versa. So don't get deterred if someone says, that's not how it works, that's not what you do, because realistically, it doesn't matter. It's up to you and your creative eye on how you shape an image. But what is most important when it comes to photography is something you'll hear me say a million times, and that is time on tools. The more time you spend with the camera in your hand, playing around with those settings, the better your photography is going to get. I feel like that goes without saying, but people underestimate it. You've heard that saying, it takes 10,000 hours to master a skill. Photography is a lifelong learning experience. Even now, after a decade being a photographer, there's still things I don't quite know, or there's still, nuance to photography that if you're not doing it, how would you know it? For me, I don't do a lot of bracketing, for example, so I wouldn't say I'm confident in bracketing. So that's something, if I wanted to go and do that, I'm gonna have to go and upskill that area. And the same for you guys. You are just getting started. Be kind to yourself. It is a very tricky art form to get your head around initially, but once you do, it is a whole lot of fun.